Good evening and welcome to you. My name is Alana Russell. As Dr. Wardlaw has mentioned, I have the privilege of serving a local congregation here in Austin, Texas, Westminster Presbyterian Church. And I am also a member of the Board of Trustees at Austin Seminary, one of the co-sponsors of tonight's event, along with the wonderful people here at the Harry Ransom Center. And I just want to take a moment to say how grateful those of us at the seminary have been to work alongside the staff and the wonderful people here at the Ransom Center. We are looking forward to more partnerships with you, and in particular, the wonderful work of Jen Tisdale and Danielle Ziegler. They have worked countless hours, and all the people over at the seminary as well, all of the people and the work that they do that you don't see. Our gratitude is immense, and it has gone very much noticed. So thank you for that. About 10 years ago, while pastor at a large church in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan, I became aware of another creative film by Martin Doblmeier called The Power of Forgiveness. Members of our congregation became inspired by the possibility to use the film as a gift to the religiously and ethnically diverse community right outside our walls. The film explores how the various faith traditions and the health sciences are convening around the topic of forgiveness, and I commend it to you. We planned a community-wide screening, followed up with Sunday morning classes, and crafted a sermon series on the topic. The artful images and the rich stories that Doblmeier tells then became the catalyst for ongoing, rich, often difficult, and sometimes heartbreaking conversations throughout my ministry there. It truly served as healing balm for many in that community and arrived just in time for the life-changing implications of the 2008 financial crisis in that auto-dependent region. So I love this kind of circling back to Detroit as I watched the film again today. I just picked up on that again. So when I learned of Doblmeier's newest film, An American Conscience, I was immediately intrigued, purchased the film, and we set to work at Westminster to provide an adult education series alongside the film on Sunday mornings. One of our panelists, Dr. Asante Todd, served as our guide. But we are thrilled that this larger public screening is now possible. For once again, Martin has tapped into the currents of our time, telling the story of a man who loved his country, but had the courage to ask probing, tough questions of her. He knew he was loved by God, but understood the limits alongside the possibilities of the human condition, that glory and tragedy of being human. And I believe that if we are willing to maintain that complexity, rather than retreat to the either-or position, where polarization and demonization flourishes. If we can sustain that truth about who we are, from that, I believe hope for the future can emerge for our world, our nation, and for ourselves. And it is that core message that I hope you have heard tonight, and that our ongoing conversation here will inspire you to share and emulate in the public square. So let's get to it. I want to introduce our panel to you tonight. I know you have information about them in your program. Does everyone have a program, or most people have a program? Maybe a few. I'm seeing a few there. First, our filmmaker tonight, Dr. Martin Doblmeier. Martin is the founder and president of Journey Films, an independent television and film company that produces award-winning films that explore religion, spirituality, history, and social issues. His work has appeared on most major television networks, including PBS, ABC, and NBC. the History Channel, and others. They have won countless awards, including this year's 2018 Wilbur Award for this film, and the 2017 Gabriel Award for American Conscience. It has been screened at festivals, universities, and symposium in the US and abroad. A little bit about Doblmeier's background. He received his BA in Religious Studies from Providence College, his master's in broadcast journalism from Boston University, and in a Niebuhrian tradition, 2 honorary doctorates as well. So thank you for being here, Martin. Next, Cynthia Rigby, professor at Austin Seminary, just wants me to tell you that she teaches theology at Austin Seminary. And the better news for her today is that her newest book, called Holding Faith, is literally out today. And you can go online. Many of us have been graced by her teaching through the years, and we're excited and proud for you, Cynthia. Next, Professor Asante Todd, another professor at Austin Seminary, newer to our faculty. And Asante wants you to know about him that he teaches ethics, and he's writing his first book. And Asante, yes, we are very excited about that. His research and writing is focusing on the topic of sovereignty. And then finally, Professor Eric McDaniel, another panelist who is here from the University of Texas. Eric is an associate professor in the Department of Government here at the university. His research looks at Black religious institutions and politics and the role of religious institutions in shaping Black political behavior. And his latest book is called Politics in the Pew, Political Mobilization of Black Churches. And I hope we'll hear a little bit about that in just a few minutes. Yes. Just a quick note how we will proceed. I'm going to begin our time together with a question that I hope will pull out a little bit more for you about each of our panelists. I'm going to allow each of them to answer this one question. And then we're going to go into a couple of more questions that we hope will create some sort of kind of a dialogue back and forth between the panelists. And then finally, we'll have a small amount of time to take questions from the audience. And so you can be thinking about that. We'll close with one last question of the panelists, and then our time will be spent together in conversation and food at the reception. So let me move over here. I wanted to begin a question posed to each of the panelists in a way that would give the audience here tonight a deeper insight into who they are, and then the unique way in which their writing and their research or just their interest has intersected with Niebuhr's. And just a quick word, the film brilliantly displays the way in which sort of the mystique around Niebuhr through the 20th century, cross generations, right? In the early 20s, Niebuhr visited post-war World War I Europe, which we saw, and knew that he was devastated by what he had witnessed. And it moved him to actually say that he would never use his pulpit to champion war again. But by the time World War II emerged and the world faced the horrors of the Holocaust, Niebuhr began writing from another perspective, correct? We see examples like this throughout his life, on into the Vietnam era, the Civil Rights Movement, and even toward the end of his life. His willingness to change his mind and to have a change of heart. This kind of evolution of thought and the tensions he writes of so well make it possible then, we have seen, for so many to have affinity with Niebuhr across the political spectrum. So we can hear both John McCain and Jimmy Carter or Barack Obama credit Niebuhr. So the question might be, which Niebuhr? And the first question I pose to you is this: what period or influence or which Niebuhr most clearly informs your research and or writing, and why? And then a quick follow-up to that: was there anything in the film that surprised you that perhaps might motivate your thinking to evolve? Martin, I'm going to start with you, even though this is a tough one for you. Which Niebuhr for you?
Which Niebuhr? Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to everybody. I mean, we have a completely filled house. I guess they can't see that on Facebook. We have a full house. Yes. How many of you are getting extra credit for being here tonight? How many of you, free food afterwards? That's a good Cindy bought this book with her, Leaves from the Notebook of a Tame Cynic. It's the first book Reinhold Niebuhr writes. And he writes it about his pastorate in Detroit. And when I started to go back, I'd mentioned before that I had studied Reinhold Niebuhr in school. It was a long time ago. I went back, and as I was committing to writing, making the film, I went back and I started poring back over all the Niebuhr materials. And when I came upon Leaves from the Notebook of a Tame Cynic, this book that he writes after his years as pastor in the Detroit church, I fell in love again with that Niebuhr. He was excited about the possibilities. He's critical of the church for not standing up and saying what it had to say. I think as you look over the arc of his life, Stanley Hauerwas would argue that as he became much more successful and a popular writer, he tended to become less courageous in his writing. He would still be analytical, but his most courageous writing was really in that early period. If you're a pastor, I can't more highly recommend this book, Leaves on a Notebook of a Tame Cynic. It's just a terrific work by a young person who's really sort of absorbing all of this material that's going on as a pastor in Detroit at the time when the city is just transforming itself, and he's in the middle of it. He's getting involved in civil rights issues for blacks and minorities in the city. It's a really wonderful piece of work, and that, I think, is the kind of, I think in many ways it's the kind of Niebuhr that I was most easily and readily attracted to.
So I doubt you really had any surprises in the film, now that you've seen it maybe 40-something odd times.
Yeah, 45.
But perhaps has watching it over the course of that time with different audiences given you any insight or...
you know, I just want to say the part of the joy for me, and my wife and I talk about this all the time, is to coming out with you. Because when I'm sitting in an edit room and I'm making this film and I'm thinking, I think that's a really funny line, I'm hoping other people do. And then the first few times that you're actually with a live audience to hear the response, it means everything to us because you've made a commitment that this is the film and you're just hoping to God that it's actually going to work. So it's a wonderful experience to listen, to watch the film together with an audience and hope that they're going to actually respond. For me, I guess the surprises are how, I guess the surprise was the disappointment that I had that Reinhold Niebuhr didn't show up at the critical moments when he was called for in the civil rights movement. Yeah. And I want to get to that as we go along here because I think that's, I've presented this film now many times in federal prisons. I'm invited to speak a lot in federal prisons. And it's very interesting in a federal prison system. The moment that they hear that he might have been admired by Reinhold Niebuhr, by Martin Luther King Jr., admired by an Andrew Young, but he did not show up when he was needed, and that in some ways discounts everything for them.
Cindy, which Niebuhr for you?
Yes, I mean, agreeing with you that Niebuhr didn't show up enough in relation to critical issues during the civil rights movement, and I think James Cone in The Cross and the Lynching Tree, talks about how shaped he was by Niebuhr, but almost cries out in that book, how could he not have noticed the correlation between the lynching tree and the cross of Jesus Christ? You know, how? He asks it over and over again. But then I couldn't help but notice that Cornel West, unlike Hauerwas, didn't, at least in the clips in the movie, didn't say that Niebuhr lost his courage later on. I mean, maybe he thought that, but he emphasized the profound impact that Niebuhr's example had on him. just with awe in his voice. And that, I'm going to have to process that and watch the movie again. So that leads to actually answering your question. Sorry, Lena. Is I think, especially watching the film, the Niebuhr that is amazing me and surprising me is the Niebuhr who's able to change, as you already noticed. What is it about Niebuhr that allowed him to keep shifting in terms of his focus, in terms of his position on issues, in terms of what he thought was most important? And I'm thinking today, there's so much pressure on all of us to brand ourselves. You know, it's all about figuring out who you are. What's your brand? Figure out who you are, set up your website, figure out who you are, and articulate it in 140 characters or less. And I'm not against any of that, but in the film, you see Niebuhr just throwing himself into the work that he believes God is calling him to do, so much so that he's not really even thinking about himself and his own persona. And that's what's consistent. I mean, apparently it led him to actually even be sick. But Howard Ross says that he doesn't have an ecclesiology, and yet in the movie you keep seeing the film go back to Union Seminary. Here it is. The students, the people that he served as a pastor, and even at the very end, Barnard College, you know, there with his with war students, his wife's students. So he's got this continuity, and in that context, he pours himself out for what he believes is right. And we need more people like that in a world where we religious people are criticized for being hypocritical. He wasn't. I mean, I'm sure he had his moments, but he was very consistent in standing up for what he thought was true. And what surprised me, I'll keep it short, is Ursula. I didn't know. I didn't know that she was a professor at Barnard. I missed that somehow. And I'm really excited to find out that she also was a professor, and I'm going to explore more about that.
Sante?
It's difficult for me to isolate one piece of Niebuhr that I find engaging. I think Niebuhr is a brilliant thinker. But I would probably want to talk about Niebuhr's ability to hold in tension polar opposites on a wide range of questions and issues. And one in particular was this question of history, of the course of history, and of our attitudes towards it. You might imagine that before Niebuhr's time, and especially during Niebuhr's early career, Niebuhr was caught up in a lot of what is called idealism, right? The idealism of the emergence of the American empire at the beginning of the 20th century. And Niebuhr is optimistic that America is going to spread democracy across the world. He's idealistic about it. But after World War I, and then of course after World War II, Niebuhr begins to realize that America is not, perhaps not necessarily as virtuous as it imagines itself to be. And so Niebuhr has to come to terms with this word that many political philosophers will use called realism, which is basically an acknowledgement that rather than being optimistic and hoping that history will be progressing towards greater and greater freedoms, that we might want to warm up to the idea, or at least come face to face with the idea that war and or conflict will be with us for a while, right? And I think Niebuhr does such a fantastic job of holding this idealism in tension with the realism, but then beyond that, finding a third position, which he calls Christian realism, which is asking, can we as Christians, or can we as a Christian society, or that term is definitely not applicable today, can we hold in tension the good and the bad without giving up hope, right? Can we hold in tension some of the good things about our society without being too optimistic or blind to the bad parts? But can we also acknowledge some of the bad parts without giving into cynicism? And I think Niebuhr offers us a way through and an answer to that question. If there's one thing that continues to frustrate me about Niebuhr, it is perhaps his maybe lifting up of the doctrine of sin again. And you know, for so long in the late 19th century of American theology, there was, again, optimism, right? Human beings, and we're getting better. Democracy was coming. Progress was coming. And Niebuhr, once again, reminds us at the beginning, in mid-20th century, of the reality of this thing we call human sin. And on one hand, I see what he's saying, especially as one coming from a culture that has been sort of on the underside of some of the American sin, right? But on the other hand, I'm also aware of the way in which that term can land in negative ways on maybe certain groups or cultures or persons who already imagine themselves in not so positive of a light. And so I wrestle with what to do with Niebuhr's concept of sin as an emphasis. Yeah.
Dr. McDaniel.
So in watching the film, what I found interesting about Niebuhr, watching the change over time, is similar to what I think about when I think about Dr. King and his lifetime and his kind of what seemed like early idealism and seemed to turn into cynicism near the end. As we celebrate the 50th anniversary of his assassination, many people point to the fact that when he went to Memphis, he was really depressed. He thought that he didn't see change in the movement. He thought racism was so deeply entrenched that nothing could come about. And it's interesting to see the idea of having this idealism when you first start off, but then when you take a few punches, you realize like, okay, it may not work out the way I wanted to. And to me that's from a personal standpoint that's important, because I think about how I've aged and things of that nature, and how I thought about this is the way the world should work. But as time goes on, you realize that some things you just leave alone. Because it's just the nature of the world. From an academic standpoint, in regards to my current research, I think what I'm really interested in is Niebuhr's love of country, but not necessarily an idealizing country. And so what you have here is a critical patriotism. So a love of nation, which says, I love you for who you are, but there are things that need to be fixed. And I think this is extremely interesting, particularly because we're, as pointed out with Billy Graham, we kind of started with Nixon and kind of moving forward, is this very strong emphasis of the U.S. being a Christian nation. Again, this idea has lasted well before them, but it's really this strong emphasis on the city upon a hill language, things of that nature, that the U.S. is infallible in God's eyes. And, I really think about how he would react to the increased use of religious language coming out of politicians, and the fact that we're now seeing pretty much every presidential speech ending, God bless America. Right. How would he react to something such as this, and given his understanding of his love for nation, but not necessarily idealizing it?
Well, I hope this question gave you a little bit of insight into each of our panelists here tonight. I'm going to move on to kind of a second question that I hope somebody will just decide to take with, and then allow y'all to discuss it amongst yourself. I was fascinated by the sort of the enormous platform that Niebuhr held. That he was on he was on the 25th anniversary cover of Time magazine in 1948. Right? Mm-hmm. People were listening to him. He was invited even though he was on the FBI watch list, right? He was still invited into the halls of power to determine public policy. And there were a lot of things, I think, converging in our world. People were searching. I think one of the presenters mentioned this kind of search for meaning in the nation. I think another factor may have been that the media structures of the time. There were probably only about 3 or 4 television outlets. There was radio, there were publications, but a very different world. So there must have been a lot of consistency of message, at least sort of a homogeneity of message that we certainly wouldn't see today. So what I would like our panelists to discuss a bit is what echoes of that time and insights from his writing might Niebuhr share with us today as we continue to struggle with the use and abuse of power and our hope for an American conscience to emerge again? And then secondly, how has our media and technology proliferation changed the capacity for conversations around these big questions of life?
Well, I'll start by taking the second part of it, which is the media is a very different place. The landscape for media today is very different than it was in Reinhold Niebuhr's time. Because it is true that during Niebuhr's time there were only a handful of television networks, a handful of radio networks, a handful of magazines, and if they loved you, you were everywhere. And that's exactly what happened to Reinhold Niebuhr, primarily because the media assumed that America was, they were looking for a white Protestant spokesperson.
What, 90% of the nation was...
And that's what, and Reinhold Niebuhr, exactly, and then
Right.
Reinhold Niebuhr fitted the bill perfectly. And that's not the case in America today. It's a very different nation. So that one of the things I keep saying too is that if you tell me where you get your news from, I can pretty much tell you how you think, right? And I think that's really one of the things that's very different because I have a journalism degree, a master's in journalism. I care very much about what's happening journalistically in America today. I can tell you that religion is on the outs. It doesn't really have a place in mainstream journalism anymore. It's been sort of relegated everywhere. Most of the newspapers in America, when I started doing this work, had journalists who were dedicated just to covering religion, and that's pretty much over these days. So the whole attitude towards how does religion intersect with American culture, I don't think journalists are really keen to that at all, and they're certainly not looking for spokespeople. But my sense is that if they were looking for people, the difference too is that in that particular time, the media would anoint somebody to be the spokesperson, literally do that. I think today in the 21st century, our media is so diluted, we as individuals have the opportunity to raise people up. We are the ones who can actually identify the people that speak directly to us. And I can tell you that if all of a sudden that person gets 10 million hits on YouTube, the media will start paying a lot of attention. Because that's the voice of the people that's starting to come up. So we have an opportunity to identify the people that, from a public theologian's point of view, can speak to us with clarity and with the precision of thought around these particular matters, and we can raise them up. And then I think the media will step in and decide we want these people because clearly they have a following of their own, and that's what's important to them. That's the most important thing for them.
You know who I think one of those people is today? That our society's chosen is Brene Brown. So hear me out. So if Niebuhr named sin and kept naming sin, even if it annoyed Asante a little how often he named it, right? As pride, right? Well, what's happening now is she has 5 million, I think, hits, 5 million, maybe more, on her TED Talk. And it's about sin, but it's the other side of sin, the sin of shame, right? Or self-deprecation, thinking of yourself in a lowly, too lowly kind of a way. And I think we have to look at that and say, I'm not saying she's the same caliber or anything, and she's the incarnation of Niebuhr, but there's something there that's similar, I think, that we're not taking note of as the church, what kind of theological impact she's having on our understanding of sin.
Is it the need for a different vocabulary, a different lexicon?
Or an
around
expanded,
something
I always like expanded lexicon.
Not different.
Well,
but
Niebuhr talked about, Judith Plaskow points this out in her book Sex, Sin, and Grace in 1980-something. She wrote on Reinhold Niebuhr, and she said, well, good job, except that he equates sin with hubris, with pride, which is all fine and dandy if your sin happens to be pride, which she says is more men than women. But she says there are some people who have more of an issue with self-deprecation. And sometimes they're even men. They cover it over with arrogance, but underneath that was sort of a joke, but take it. But yeah, so expanding our vocabulary beyond, I think you implied some of this when you said you worry about Niebuhr's talk of sin, that it might be harmful to certain groups. But if we expanded what constitutes sin beyond pride, concupiscence, and so forth, to also be self-deprecation and shame. Brene Brown, we might be able to say something helpful in our culture.
Lana, I'm always going back again and again to this question of power and Niebuhr. And I think that's a question that is probably more and more prevalent with each maybe second or growing day.
It occurred to me as we were talking about the platform that he had, that the homogeneity was not necessarily all good, because that meant that voices were being silenced, correct?
Yes.
That there were voices, but maybe ones without the power.
Well, yeah, so Niebuhr's wrestling with, I think Niebuhr's one of the first Christian theologians to seriously wrestle with the material reality of power, right? In ways that don't allow us to narrate it away in a nice story about how God is turning every power into a good power, right? Niebuhr wants to have us confront the ugliness and the nastiness of some of the human reality of power. And I think Niebuhr's specifically directing this commentary on power at a particular kind of class, right? What he would call the bourgeois class, or what we might call upper middle class or upper class in American society. Niebuhr's wanting to deliver this reality of a nasty side of power to, I think, his own culture, in a sense, for that culture to look at it and to see the ways that power is being, that power is functioning through what they believe are innocent and virtuous and maybe innocuous actions. I think that's what Niebuhr is trying to do. And so I think he's trying to get at these power dynamics indirectly, right? I don't think he directly always calls out oppression and injustice, but I think what he's trying to do is have his own culture rethink power so that maybe his own culture behaves differently towards other cultures. That's what I see Niebuhr doing, sort of doing some internal cultural work. One of the ways that Niebuhr saw power working, for example, is through this idea of nationalism, or this ideology of nationalism. Niebuhr believed that it was very easy for all of us to get caught up in patriotic passion about the nation and sort of become blind to the negative parts of it. Why? Because of the absolute devotion and selflessness with which we give ourselves to the nation, right? If we give ourselves with such selflessness to this nation, surely the result of this must be good, right? And Niebuhr wanted to have us rethink that and say, no, there are power dynamics there beyond the individual, so that some things that emerge as a result of that are problematic on other cultures and groups. So like Eric was saying, Niebuhr is having America to question itself as a nation on the cusp of a point in history where it imagined itself as sort of carrying the torch that Europe had passed to it to be the civilizing force in the global world, right? So I think Niebuhr offers just an important criticism in that respect. Yeah.
Okay, building off what Sade was talking about in regards to power and how Niebuhr confronts power, that is one of the major things we're concerned about in political science. And specifically when Niebuhr was talking about the importance of democracy as a way to check against, the evils of power, within political science, we are concerned about that. There's a classic argument of pluralism, which contends that various groups have power in various ways, and that it's all about the ability for these groups to mobilize and combat each other, to check each other, to make sure that one group does not abuse their power. And so theoretically, this sounds great. So classic work is Robert Dahl's Who Governs. And this is a text I read, I think, in at least 4 grad classes, and we spent the rest of the semester talking about why this is wrong. Because we realized that in order for that this idea of power, that some groups are better able to harness their power more so than others. And I think, with this discussion kind of the systematic nature of racism, classism, sexism, the systematic nature of these things does, which he gets at, but not fully fleshes out, because one of the major failures of democracy is that in order for democracy to work effectively, the groups have to be able to mobilize to protect their interests. And one of the things we continually find is that the groups who are the most marginalized are the ones who are least able to mobilize to protect their interest. And this creates a problem where the virtues of democracy allow for great evils to exist.
All right, one more question, and then we'll head to the audience. It's a simple question, and that is, who would you want in today's world, or it doesn't have to be today's world, but who would you might want to put Niebuhr in conversation with?
Do I go first?
No first, just whoever wants to shout out.
I've been thinking about this,
Okay.
and I guess the person that pops into my head would be Ta-Nehisi Coates. So what you have,
Tell the audience.
so Ta-Nehisi Coates, so the worked for the Atlantic, and is most famous for his work Between the World and Me. And the book is really a letter to his son, and it's basically about the travails of racism, and especially being a black man in America. And it kind of talks about really what he understands is really the persistence of racism, how it may never go away. And so thinking about Niebuhr and his acknowledgement of sin, and that, it's not that once we're all nice to each other, all of these things will go away. Like it will stay with us forever. I think Coates has that as well. Now, what's interesting about this is that Cornel West has attacked Coates for almost, I guess, fetishizing white supremacy, and it's something we cannot combat. And if you read Between the World and Me, you do get a sense of that. Like it's extremely pessimistic. You're like, well, what do we do now? But the idea there, I think he's like, look, we're not going to get away from this, and we must find a way to deal with it. So it'd be very interesting how they would interact within this discussion of really acknowledging the limitations of human goodness in many ways.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'll say Donald Trump. Look, the consequences are so enormous, what we're confronting today. I'd just like somebody like a Reinhold Niebuhr to be able to go into the Oval Office and say, look, one New Yorker to another, say, look, you have all the power in the world. Let's start thinking in terms of being responsible about using of this power. And I think that whole notion, and I think Donald Trump would say, you never earned more than $10,000 a year in your life. What do you have to say to anybody? And that's the kind of dynamic that I think it would start. But my hope and my prayer would be somewhere along the line, the notion of the care of this country and what's going to happen to all of us in the future will start to take precedent. But I think Reinhold Niebuhr would be one of the people I'd really enjoy sending in there to have that conversation.
I can feel the FBI file reopening.
It's opening up right now. So, and that's the mark of that's the mark of a public theologian. You have to write that down.
Yeah.
You have an FBI file on you.
Yeah, that's
So
true.
whether it's Martin Luther King Jr. or Reinhold Niebuhr or Dorothy Day or these characters,
right.
there was an FBI file, and that's the thing that we have to think about in terms of. You were talking, Eric, about the notion of being, balancing patriotism and the willingness to speak out and openly. But the truth of the matter is, in the 40s and the 50s, that would oftentimes wind you up. If you spoke out, especially if you spoke out of a biblical perspective, that wound you up on the FBI list, and it did make life miserable. Elizabeth Sifton was not kidding when she said her life as the daughter of Reinhold Niebuhr was not easy because of what was going on at that time. His mother, his wife, her mother, was really, they delayed her citizenship in America because of it. There were some nasty consequences, but he spoke out openly and publicly and took the fall for it often.
I'd set Niebuhr at a table with Eric Weiner. Do you know that name? He wrote a book called Man Seeks God, and he's sort of a famous nun, not N-U-N, N-O-N-E, religiously non-affiliated person. And I think he would, well, I know what Weiner would say, because he says it all the time. He would say, well, I just can't call myself religious because I'm too skeptical about things. I'm too much of a skeptic. I'm afraid, if I take a leap where I might land, would be in the wrong place and I'm going to do damage. And I think maybe Reinhold Niebuhr would say, I'm right with you. You know, I mean, there's room for skepticism in religious faith, in religious life, and you just keep going after it, and you keep changing course when necessary, and you keep repenting and waking up the next day and going after it again. And I just like to see what they had to say to each other. I think it'd be interesting.
What about you, Asante?
I think I would have Reinhold Niebuhr sit down and have a conversation with a woman by the name of Mahalia Jackson. Mahalia Jackson, somewhat well-known gospel singer who has sung just about every preacher you can think of under the table with her ministry. If you don't know Mahalia Jackson's singing and songs, I encourage you to listen. Why would I have Niebuhr talk with Mahalia Jackson? I think when Niebuhr confronted the reality of power, he also confronted two other realities, the perennial nature of both conflict and of war. And I think Niebuhr, for the rest of his life, was struggling with how to find hope beyond that space, right? Once we acknowledge the space of conflict and war, how do we find hope beyond that? And I think for me, Mahalia Jackson, and not just Mahalia Jackson, but she is symbolic for me of the kind of figures and I would say prophets and poets that are able to do that, right? There's a great essay by another theologian by the name of Howard Thurman called "The Negro Spiritual Speaks of Life and Death." And what Thurman says in that essay is that one of the fascinating things about the Negro spiritual is that it is one of the places where you will find a face-to-face confrontation with war and annihilation, the reality of annihilation, right? Given the black experience in America, but you also find the possibility and the reality of transcendence beyond that. And I think that that's one of the things that we need right now in our culture, right? I think a lot of us are coming face to face with this reality that history maybe is not progressing the way we thought it was, and now there's conflict and there's war again, and all these different cultural wars. How do we find a moment or a space of transcendence beyond that? I think those kinds of questions are answered, among other places, in Negro spirituals, and Mahalia Jackson for me is symbolic of that.
Yeah, I mean, when you said that, the first thing that came to my head was the song "Never Alone." It starts off with, I've seen the lightning flash, I've heard the thunder roll, I felt the sin breakers dashing, break my soul. And then I heard the voice of Jesus say, and it's the idea of this confrontation of everything's against you, but there is somebody there. And so, and I guess one of my things with I guess from the black religious perspective, pushing back with Niebuhr, is this idea of saying God's will. Well, the problem is you have a group of people who have to believe it's God's will for them to be free, because if not, they might as well just give up. And so I guess in many ways his arguments, while they're nuanced, I think are very good, and I agree with a lot of what he says. It's also spoken from somebody who has a certain level of privilege that allows him to not take these very strong fundamentalist beliefs, because to be able to address the complexity of the world, where you have individuals who just seek to be free, and because of that, they're not concerned about the complexities of the world in general, but the oppression of their own world.
We have time for a couple of questions, and you've got your hand up first. So we do not have amplification, so I need you to stand. And
I'm pretty loud as it is.
Okay, good.
I was struck by one small element, by many elements in the film, but one particularly that we're panning on the Ford assembly line, talking about how difficult the working conditions were on that assembly line. Then it showed the family sitting in an open Model A, I guess it was. And the question was, do they know what the cost of that automobile was. To them, in dollars, it was not a lot for many families, but it strikes me that we do not understand the cost of those things that we have so readily at our convenience, that we have forgotten to look into the human cost of so much of what we consume. And I would hope that Niebuhr, were he alive today, would focus on that kind of process and preach and teach us to understand that notion, that we live greatly at the horrible expense of others.
Is there anybody that'd like to respond? If you could kind of encapsulate so the overflow crowd could understand his comment.
Well, to me, the comment about the photograph that shows Niebuhr in the front seat of the car, and then, but I hope you notice that in the back seat of that car was his mother and father.
I understand.
So one of the things that's pretty clear is that whoever was actually paying for it, it was being bought for on a pastor's salary. So it couldn't have been that expensive a car at the time, right? You have to think about that. But Niebuhr's really celebrated, I think, at that particular time because he's one of the first people. At a time when America is putting Henry Ford on the cover and celebrating this as the new moment in America, and there's an enormous national pride about we're creating this thing and the world is going to be better, that part of the utopia, that we're going to create this utopian world. Niebuhr's one of the few voices who are actually speaking openly and publicly about the fact that this is working primarily for the industrial overlords. And he would say in that same book, the book Leaves from a Notebook of a Tame Cynic, that the industrial overlord will not give up power until it's taken from them. That's basically what he's suggesting, which is revolutionary for a pastor to be saying.
I think in going along with that, with the question about the toll, the human toll, I think that is where you see the strong push for reparations coming from. And so the fact that the nation was built upon, slave labor, the fact that many of the industries or banking industries that we champion today made their money through the slave trade, and the fact that there were human lives sacrificed for this. I think with the recent healthcare debate, there's this idea that these individuals are working so hard to provide you with these services, but not getting the same thing. I believe, if you think of the way Obama framed his rhetoric, it was about being aware of the human cost, or the cost in terms of human capital. And I think Niebuhr does recognize that in some way, simply with his critique of Ford. But I think you can see it today within Obama's rhetoric regarding the expansion of healthcare access.
Let us know if your question is directed to a particular person.
Niebuhr was obviously a witness for his Christian faith, and he began that witness strongly in the Bethel Church, but ended up, as you pointed out, strongly within the academic and the seminary. My question is, if Niebuhr were here today facing the disinstitutionalization of so many of our institutions in the place we are today, including the church, and the scattering of the voice of the church, how would you see a Niebuhr responding to the disarray and the disinstitutionalization that's going on, particularly with the church, and where he might be pushing or working around that particular institution in America today?
So how would Niebuhr respond to the disestablishment of institutional life across many educational churches, and where might he push back on that? Is that the question?
Understanding the moral man and the immoral society, and yet we're all members of organizations and institutions, particularly the church, which is divided and maybe even marginalized in many cases. And how would you see him responding?
I think he would tell us that we're being wimpy as religious leaders, church leaders, and that we need to challenge people more, instead of saying we have to do a better job of making them feel comfortable and catering to their every whim, I wanted to read a short entry from this book we keep quoting that I think really does speak to the question. So this is a story of when he was a pastor, if I might, in Detroit, his kind of little sketches from his life. He says, I'm glad there are only, 1915 is the year. I am glad there are only, oh, pardon me, Leaves from the Notebook of a Tamed Cynic.
It's the worst title ever, isn't it?
I have to look at it to remember it myself, but it's from when he was a pastor. So he says, and I think this might get at the question. I'm glad there are only 18 families in this church. I have been visiting the members for 6 weeks and haven't seen all of them yet. Usually I walk past a house 2 or 3 times before I summon the courage to go in. I am always very courteously received, so I don't know exactly why I should not be able to overcome this curious timidity. I don't know that very much comes of my visits, except that I really get acquainted with the people. Usually after I've made a call, I find some good excuse to quit for the afternoon. I used to do that in the days gone by when I was a book agent, but there was reason for it then. I needed the afternoon to regain my self-respect. Now it seems to be pure laziness and fear. Laziness and fear. The people are a little discouraged. Some of them seem to doubt whether the church will survive, but there are a few who are the salt of the earth. And if I make a go of this, they will be more responsible than they will ever know. So I think it's incredible that this courageous man talks so candidly about his fear of just walking in a house and being in relationship, a kind of relationship that makes demands, that makes demands on us and makes demands on the people that we're serving. And we're so afraid of making any demand on anyone now because we think they'll leave. Well, they're leaving. I think Niebuhr would say because we're making no demands and have no accountability to each other, no challenge.
We're running close to the end of our time, and I want each of the panelists to be able to give us a recommended read, perhaps not from Niebuhr's more well-known books, but perhaps an essay they've read or some kind of article or something that might be edifying for you and for others to share. So anyone have one they would like to?
Well, I'm going to go out and
offer
read
up?
Cindy's book after this.
Yeah.
That's my recommendation.
Holding faith.
So I do recommend, I know there's a lot of pastors. How many pastors are here tonight? Just by, oh, come on. And how many of you have read this book that we're talking about, Leaves? Yeah, see, and if you haven't, it really is something else to read it. I mean, I thought for a while I might want to go into sort of a pastor's role, but when I chose a different path in my life, But when I pulled this back out again to start to do the research on it, it's just a wonderful way to think of a young pastor deciding that this is his commitment. But he's very critical, to answer your question, sir, he's very critical of what the church is not doing properly. He said that ultimately the churches tend to sort of side with the prejudices and the priorities of the middle class. And there can be no expectation that it's going to be, the end result is going to be social transformation. And so I think in some ways what we're all calling for right now in our world is some social transformation, and I think the place to look for that is in the church, within the ecclesial bodies. Hopefully that's where it's going to come from.
This is the book I brought, as you keep hearing about, but if I could say one thing that I wanted to get out tonight, if anyone wants to discuss with me James Cone's take on Niebuhr in his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, what I think James Cone is saying is that it might be a little bit similar, actually, in one particular way to Hauerwas's critique in the movie. So I think Cone says that unlike MLK, Niebuhr settles too easily for something less than the kingdom of God. He says this as someone who loves and adores and is shaped by Niebuhr. But he says, finally, MLK is never going to be satisfied for anything, will never be satisfied for anything less than the kingdom, which is impossible. I mean, even though it is impossible to establish it on earth as it is in heaven, MLK won't let it go. And he's a little disappointed, I think, that Niebuhr is willing to say, well, we're not going to be able to get there from here, so let's go for as far as we can. And I'm just thinking theologically and spiritually about the difference when one lives believing that the impossible can be made possible versus saying, we're not going to get there, so let's see where we can get. What's the difference? Yeah. Yeah.
If you lower your standards, you may function better than if they're too high. That's what Abraham Lowe, a Jewish writer, said for mental health reasons. But if you lower your standards a little, then you're, well,
What if Abraham, just saying, what if Abraham lowered his standards when God said, so shall your descendants be, and said, one will be enough? That's already hard enough to achieve, even with the best fertility treatments we have available. We gotta talk more. I don't know.
One other quick announcement before we close. For those of you that would like to continue this conversation, and there may be those among you, there are people here tonight that would like to do that. And the seminary is open to providing some kind of forum for that in the days ahead if there are enough of you that would like to continue this conversation in some kind of forum. Melissa Wigginton, will you stand and raise your hand? And you can find her at the reception, and she will take your name down, as well as Asante or Cindy or myself. We're happy to continue conversation with you about what maybe a call to action might look like from a Niebuhrian standpoint. So the pastor and me feels like we need to close in this particular way. As most of you are aware, the words Niebuhr is most known for are printed in your program here tonight, what has come to be known as the Serenity Prayer. Its standard use with Alcoholics Anonymous has provided a prayer or mantra for countless individuals on their road to recovery and others who find its words inspiring so that they can just take the next step on this human journey. In some ways, it is within these words that we see the whole of Niebuhr's system, although he probably wouldn't like that word, this system of theology which informed his political philosophy. And I think I've read or heard this prayer more times than I can remember. More often than not, though, it's typically with individuals in mind. God grant me the serenity is how we normally hear it. But I am learning anew from the depths of this film that its visionary vocabulary should also belong to our common life. For there are indeed things we cannot change, and the irony of human history reminds us of that daily. But there are things we can change if we have the courage and the gift of one another along the way. Niebuhr would pray for us that we are granted the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. So may that be our call to action: grace, serenity, courage, and wisdom. Thank you for coming.